Grifter's Bible, a novel by El Shaboons, read by El Shaboons, with sound design by Monumental Sonic Architecture. Chapter 18, Chinese Boxes. Long before the Rockefeller Commission and the scandals that arose in the wake of the New York Times public release of revelations regarding MK Ultra and subsequent government-funded experiments involving mental torture and panic-induced truth-telling, independent contractors on the research and development end of the industry took the burden of security upon themselves. They began subscribing to an infinite variety of tenebrous means, theoretical esoterica and praxis, to bulwark the unsavory nature of their work from prying eyes. And no one was better at sneaking the stink of their genius beneath the nose of the world than Dr. James Abraham. After leaving Guantanamo Bay in a nest of flames, James buttoned up about his research as much as he could possibly get away with while still maintaining whatever contractual obligations he might incur from IM and their ilk. He only did the bare minimum that he had to do to fund his private work and put his kids through school. Even though Dr. Abraham grew opaque in conversations about his research as his mind slowly pixelated over the final year of our working relationship, he would still find ways to communicate choice findings. Under the table, he would pass along the strange maps of dark continents tucked inside the deeper contours in the cartography of the cerebral cortex that he had uncovered. He would whisper here and there about how he had knitted these hidden lands into cohesive latitudes using the Mandelbrot set as his thread. James loved his work. I remember clawing at the curtains of thick mental fog that enshrouded me like a caul in the afterbirth of my first inpatient morning at Timberglen. The locust sound of someone out in the hall woke me up. They were whistling This Little Light of Mine through dry lips. The scrawny echo of a melody rippled off the institutional-grade VCT flooring tiles. Slapback reverberations pogoed off the walls. "Hello?" I called out a hello to the closed door. I flinched back from the ferrous stank of my own bad motor morning breath. The burn of acid reflux scalded my throat with a backwash of bilirubin. There was no reply from behind the door. Just the same dusty tune. "Hello?" I raised my head off of the pillow and fidgeted, but my wrists were taped to the bed railing so I couldn't get up. I fell back into the sweat that soaked the pillow. Chills like spiny rhythms skittered up and down my back. The ceiling leered. The textured tiles blurred in and out of focus. I sucked a breath in. Tiny shadows scrabbled like an Armageddon of ants. I blew my breath out in a pant. The mild hallucination resolved into an alphabet soup of vaguely Hebraic figures that seemed to contextualize. I inhaled. Long lines of dry code lit up the air above my bed like a baby's mobile. I exhaled. The shadow ants on the ceiling were still slam dancing on the tiles. The whistle in the hall began to trail off with a rolling rubber squeak. The persistent sounds grew steadily softer as distance swallowed them. If the whistling was an incantation, it sounded desperate that its voodoo be done. The shackles of quilted medical tape securing my wrist to the bed frame were removed after the initial 24-hour observation period that I had to go through at intake had expired. So once my traveling meds wore off and my legs would hold me, I started roaming the halls searching for the source of the whistling just because it was something to do. That's how I discovered James Abraham was in inpatient care there as well. He was slouching in a wheelchair in a reading nook in the library in front of one of the floor-to-ceiling picture windows. James acted like he didn't notice me at first. His eyes were nailed to a black car in the visitors' parking lot. Twilight activated the photocell that controlled the lights on the hospital grounds. An audible whoosh of relief came out of James. I looked up. The Buick was exiting down the arboreal path that led past the guard shack into the gates. Once those brake lights disappeared, James wouldn't shut up. He started dropping discourses at dinner that evening, drawing diagrams on our paper napkins. Anytime we weren't in therapy or sleeping off our meds, he was lecturing or testing my recall of some tutorial that he had presented. The week before my discharge, he described a process that he had developed and dubbed basal ganglia hypnosis, a method of inserting large volumes of complex chains of information into the deep memory during prolonged states of unconsciousness, where they would remain irretrievable from storage without the application of a specified stimuli to the basal ganglia, which in turn would select the action of releasing the data from deep storage. I didn't mark these lectures as any more or less significant than any of the other things he taught me, until the night of 1 million views. The weird pink haze that had squatted across the Metroplex all week was neutralized that Friday. A cleansing rain had roiled out of Corpus Christi that morning and rolled up the coast, crossing the pines and up Highway 45 to sweep the air and rinse the top layer of soot from off of the streets of Deep Ellum.
Brother Smith! Brother Smith! Brother Smith!
The chanting began even earlier than usual.
No one lights a candle and then hides it like a secret. You can't keep a candle cooped up in a closet and still expect it to shine. You bring it out and put it on a candlestick so everyone in the house can see the light. Can y'all see the light?
All of the drama that he'd sought to foster for the occasion was there in spades when Seth appeared at the foot of the stairs like a one-man parade with a hyper-processed microphone. Whistles and catcalls squealed in my ears. Mary struck up the testifying and the band played him on stage with Beginning to See the Light. Beryl was covering for me on drums, so I faded back and slipped upstairs. Outside, the rain dampened into intermittent spits and surges. The wind and the long thunder shook the window in the rat's nest. The beast had taken a knee 2 Sundays in a row and things went from bad to worse that night. It started out when the Z-axis almost failed to initialize. The relay couldn't align its firing of directed nanobursts at every 1.875 degrees around the axes to define the mandala-like boundaries of the magnetic field. I brought the beast out of standby when the band played Voice from the Mountain, and all of my apps were visibly erratic. Right off the bat, standard time markers for the completion of tasks started slowing to a crawl. Binding channels would hang like they weren't supposed to, and then from out of nowhere, the next burst suite in the program would leapfrog into context before the preceding effect had abated into artifacts. And during the second verse, when I threw a randomizing sequencer into the burst suite to try and outsmart some of the lag, there was a heavy thump from inside of the wall just beyond the battery array. After that, nothing flowed smoothly. It was 3 choruses of ham-handed ballet and sharp sawtooth left turns from one of James's presets to the next level. I stumbled over to the observation slit and hunkered down. The heat of a demon's breath screamed in my face when I tried to look down onto the darkness of the sanctuary writhing between the walls. When the steam on my glasses cleared, I could see Seth standing in a halo with the whole world in his hands.
Y'all feel that?
He thrust a calming palm above the restless heads in the pit. Fingers reached back for him. An absolute juvenile silence fell on the people as they held their breath. I typed in a simple sequence and the relay began firing in a signature pattern. The shoulders of the sheep hunched with shivers and their eyes closed in concentration. Vast smiles crawled across their satisfied faces. The burst packets sped up in frequency and then leveled back off. The beast was moving. It was limping into the burial ground. The street team wandered from clatch to clatch, collecting empty plates and effluvia and refreshing red cups of iced tea for the guests. Wrapped in an oleo of sweats, the whole place smelled like movie popcorn and onion feet. By 9 o'clock, the number of the night was getting close, so the front door was shut to block out distractions from the nightlife. Seth's people gathered around the stage with styrofoam china full of gnawed bones and half-eaten cake in one hand and their smartphones ingeniously balanced in the other. They wanted to freak out and be around at the beginning of something great, to see it happen when the spark jumped out of the flint and onto the brush. That's all it takes to start an inferno. Fat fiddled with the faders, rolling EQ knobs between his middle finger and thumb like pairs of hot dice. He'd been circling the relevant frequencies like a school of sharks throughout the night, slowly closing the circle on 7 Hz when the consciousness of the mass would flip over into trance state. Buoyed on waves of the people's heat, Seth's simple declarations boomed throughout the room. Dangling in the spotlight with his audience wrapped in a hot flash of emotion, Seth rolled the cotton sleeves of his best white shirt up to his elbows. He turned his back to the crowd long enough to gauge how much time he had left before the millionth view. Simmering convection rose off of his shoulders and hair. He turned back around and his beard was glowing like a burnished aureole above his heart. I looked away from the observation slit and yawned.
Matthew said, "Let your light shine before men that they may see your fine works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven."
Seth gloated like he didn't need to say anymore, but then he did anyway.
"We are approaching a milestone, a moment this church has been waiting for. But this moment is not the end of our labors. Our candle's just getting lit. Just as the Lord continues, so does this church. And just as this ministry is endless, so is my desire to shine the gospel that lights my way onto the dark paths of others. Evil shadows are knocking at our door, but a mighty torch, sanctified by the word, has been placed in our hands to drive that darkness back. Now, starting here tonight, I'm ready to call the world to crawl out of their dark corners and come over here closer so that they can see this light we share. I want everyone to walk the illuminated way. I already talked to you about the Gospels plenty, but when you leave here tonight, I want you to take a psalm in your heart. Make it a good one."
Mary naughtily popped off like she couldn't contain herself. Her tambourine rattled in short bursts of 30 seconds like a rattlesnake's tail. Seth threw his head back and laughed at her zeal. He snorted.
"Which one do you want?"
119.
She beamed, just like they'd blocked out.
"Okay."
Seth pinched his chin.
"Verse 105 is one of my favorites."
Seth settled it with an approving nod just like they'd rehearsed.
"Y'all know that one?"
He aimed the mic out. And then from the depths of the evening's trance came a single voice from the mass. A physical force as loud as a jet engine roared out across the praying floor. 201, the sheep bleated out in an unbidden chorus. "The word is a lamp for my feet and a light on my path." As the night arrived at 1 million views of our promotional video, windblown raindrops thumped at the window. I just had to go back downstairs to take a look at the spectacle. Fat had donned his telly in preparation for the band's congratulatory number. Once he'd tuned up and adjusted his strap, he leaned over to Seth's computer and hit refresh on the video's page. He stepped towards his mark at stage right. Mary's hand rattled out 64th notes on the tambourine like incessant cicadas. On the bedsheets behind the band, the view count finally jumped from 6 numbers to 7. Barrel hit the cymbals and the fanfare began. The room exploded. Every foot but mine launched from the floor in a leap of joy. Bodies rose up in the dusky room like a wall of ink before my eyes. I swam against the tide to the front of the house. I didn't need to see Seth to gauge his reaction. The alpha roar of triumph that he let off when he finally got his way rattled the glass and the skylights. Channeled through the pumped-up PA, Seth's voice shook the floor like a train rumbling past a platform. The flock was levitating, hung in the hands of their man. Then the people descended, and a thunderclap of feet returning to the earth boomed. Mary's tambourine was like a swarm of bees scratching honey from off of the walls inside of my head. The stroboscopes Catherine wheeled, glinting off of the polished chrome laminate of the acrylic ichthus fish adhered to the side of the roads near Dwayne's right hand. His fat fingers were dancing as I watched him stretching and exercising them like a runner at the block. In the corner of my ear, I could hear the bleed-through of Fat counting the band in. and then Dwayne leapt at the keys. The smoldering tip of a cone of incense sitting in a saucer on top of the organ broke off and 2 distinct puff rings of smoke escaped the ember. Dwayne played a fairground intro and then barrel rolled in on the snare and double kick. Dwayne's bass notes resolved into a pulsing melody that synced up with the chiming arpeggios that Fat was playing through. Phantom harmonics created an explosion inside of my head. I felt whistling between my ears. Before Seth could even start singing, I knew the words that were coming. Something big was rolling down a disinfected hallway somewhere inside my deep memory. Everyone knew the words and sang it in the same smarmy way that Seth did when he dragged consonants out over extended syllables. Seth's hound dog inflections came out at a perfect 7 hertz through the speakers. Every voice in the room was like some great yawning choir drenched in reverb that stretched out to the stars. It was alien and scary. Anxiety killed my buzz. I could feel molten liquid fill the dank chamber in my guts. The 2 rings of smoke from the incense joined, connecting quadrant to center until they formed a vesica Pisces. The key to Visuddhimagga swam from out of the vessel of the fish. I could feel the pop vibrating off of my cochlea. A great pressure that I hadn't even noticed was lifted in an instant, and a wide open feeling like mentholatum liberated my equilibrium. A white ooze blossomed inside the proscenium arch. A light in the sanctuary danced like cum underwater. A cloud formed. Sharp white sparks shot from out of the liquid flutter like darts through the 4th wall. They screamed straight for a bullseye in the middle of my forehead. I looked around. No one else was concerned. I knew it was all occurring inside of my head. Behind my shocked face, lips agog, dangling like tsitsits. Waves of black floodwater washed over my eyes, but the light in my pineal gland was shining brightly, and I could somehow make out the sound of the song rising out of the negative space where I last saw the flock. The notes of the melody aspirated into atoms of light, tiny enough to go zitzing through a meniscus that had barred the existence of the vast catalog of information that James had implanted inside of my head from my perception. A hard-charging stargate of argent characters marched into my Cartesian theater. Rainbow tables and a strange gematria of prime numbers and special characters soared across the room to dive-bomb my senses. A Kabbalistic cipher came roaring out of the darkness in a stampede of iconography that leapt from my face but dropped like a herd of buffalo into a black hole at the tip of my nose. The onslaught of violent information continued to release into my senses until Seth brought the song back down to the ground. The melody stopped and the darkness faded away. My hearing realigned first, and I could make out the giddy bustle of the crowd as Seth outlined his future plans. A sheep's leg of slobber had joined the back of my hand to my lower lip with a tendon of drool, but no one was looking, so I scooped it up and wiped my mouth with my sleeve. Slowly, my vision returned. Compos mentis once again, I got to my feet and slipped back upstairs. I brought the beast down and called a cab. I slipped out the front door and stood behind the beaded curtain of runoff spilling down the parapet. Beyond the dribbling veil was a Walpurgis Nacht of raindrops reflecting neon, LEDs, and the general fluorescence of the city through each tiny lens, so that the night seemed to burn with billions of falling candles. The driver was idling at the curb. His belly was pressed against the steering wheel. It glowed green from the dashboard. Rills of heat vapor rose off of the hood. Purple tendrils reached out through the orange rain. Ribbons of blue exhaust turned violet as they wafted up from the tailpipe and floated through the red glow of the yellow cap's brake lights. I could see a crane sticking up across the street. I could make out the revolving pattern of amber warning beacons illuminating the power pole. A bucket was suspended in space next to the box. The wide shoulders of a yellow rain slicker hunkered down behind the service door. I made a run for the back door of the cab. I was still soaked by the time I made it. I squeaked across the vinyl upholstery. I looked out the side window as I leaned over to pull my socks up. A bell started ringing caution. I took a look at the bucket truck. The crane bucked. The logo on the side of the door read Lone Star Electric. The bucket was coming down fast. I dropped down in the seat, hiding my face.
Where we heading?
The driver folded his Dallas Sentry and sat it in the passenger seat.
Private stowage.
I told him to cross streets. I poked my head up to check on the bucket. It was almost down. I looked forward in alarm. The cabbie zeroed out the meter in slow motion. The crane arm rested into its cradle. I was certain I was hallucinating. What I thought was a lone hulking yellow figure split into two separate rain-slickered phantoms. The headlamped pair of wraiths moved like cyclopic shadows as they extricated themselves from the bucket. The headlights blinked as one of the yellow figures ran past them towards the passenger side of the truck. I panted.
If this truck follows us, I'll give you $40 if you can lose them. Make it 50 and they won't even stand a chance.
The cab driver leaned forward on the tree and shifted into D.
Done.
I just wanted to go.
Looks like Mooney's eating all the sides on the menu tonight.
He laughed to himself as he dreamed of lunch. The driver dropped his lead foot to the floor and we screeched from the curb. We weren't a block gone when I saw the Lone Star Electric truck pull out. I was about to sweat the driver into picking up the pace, but then he sluiced through the half-red light and we leaned to the right like a bobsled crew in a whiplashed left turn onto Hall Street. We had fresh green lights for the next 6 blocks and he was driving like he intended to make them all. I checked behind us and saw the utility truck's headlights hampered to a halt by the red light that we had narrowly averted. Like a bull taunted in the chute, I could see the truck stamping to go, snorting exhaust out in impatience. I looked forward in alarm as the warning lights on the gates at the light rail crossing began blinking, but the driver just gunned it and hydroplaned across the tracks. The bucket truck finally ran the red light onto Hall, but it was too late. The gates were down by the time the truck reached the tracks. The train cut them off from view a second later, and then the cab entered the St. Stephen's campus. We just blended in with the other cabs, eventually melting into the greater body of traffic traveling west on Live Oak. I didn't see the truck behind us.
Where you want out at?
The cabbie swung a hard left onto Good Latimer, abruptly exiting the tide of traffic. He skirted the 2-story warehouse. I had him pull up next to a large and dark oak tree outside the fence that blocked out the streetlight and provided the only sort of cover I could see in the vicinity. I emptied my pockets and handed over $70. I'd barely closed the back door when the cab's brake lights disappeared around the corner. I was alone. I made my way to where the dumpster sat just inside the fence. I took a long look around and then grabbed a post with each hand. I stuck my leg through and used one of the dumpsters to boost myself up to the top of the line of spiked fence posts. Slowly, I put my weight on my arms and swung one leg over the top. The tips of each post were pressed flat into pointed diamond shapes. I was acutely aware that they were less than 3 inches away from my balls as I tried to set a foot down on top of the dumpster. My shoulders were shaking as I strained my leg out over the void as far as it would go. My arms were melting in lactic acid. I breathed a grateful sigh when my toe bumped the lid of the dumpster. I didn't see the puddle I put my foot into. My leg slipped out from under me. I could feel the fence pressing up into my taint.
Oh, no you don't.
I white-knuckled the crossmember with both fists and pushed myself up as far as my mealy muscles would hold me. I bungled my other leg over and then I was in. A gust of wind tried to topple me from off the top of the dumpster, so I scrambled down to the ground. I sprinted out of the shadows through the mist, racing across the parking lot for the door to the warehouse. I picked my PIN number into the keypad next to the security door and the lock clicked. I'd lived there off and on since my bankruptcy. The cops wouldn't enter the building unless there was a body, so once the counter staff went home at night, it was a free zone to do whatever you want. I had run 12-volt power off the building's main line to my unit upstairs. I could work as long as I needed and no one would bother me. I climbed the cement stairs to the second floor of hall after hall of sheet metal vaults. My lock didn't look like it had been tampered with since the last time I'd come around. I opened the door and all my stuff looked the same. I pulled Visuddhimagga out of the couch and started rearranging things so I could get to the aircraft case my gear was stowed in. I found a laptop with 32 gigabytes of RAM and confirmed that the power I'd run was still alive. I cleared enough boxes off of the couch to take a seat at one end. James had forced me to memorize a line of code for a Prism translation program that he cryptically predicted would open up a new world to me. I wrote out the code and then opened Visuddhimagga, removing the drive hidden inside and plugging it into the USB port on the laptop. Instead of opening the Wall of Fire exe, I imported it into the translation program, and sure enough, the DOS prompt appeared. But there was no unraveling white text. No ominous countdown. Only a blinking cursor. I could feel the pressure building behind my eyes. The cipher wanted out. I entered the maze at midnight when I closed my eyes and began automatically typing characters into a text document. Without trying, my brain was able to associate the volumes of non-Western characters that James had implanted into my head with arcane combinations of QWERTY keystrokes that were anything but intuitive and would have been impossible for the average hacker to learn and recall through anything less than artificial means. My synesthesia highlighted massive chunks of text, uniting non-adjacent sections into color-coded priorities as I typed. I began copying any of the sections of the code that came out in bold red and pasted those into James's Prism app. The program must have opened up 20 windows to process the load as the translator began chewing the code down to size. The typing and translation carried on for hours into the red-eyed dawn. When the numbers were done coming, I rubbed my eyes and watched as the screen began blinking. Then the slaughter began. The first machine went down in a blue screen, dying with a silent scream, exhausted by the level of processing the translation was demanding. I had to type all of the code back out on a second laptop because I forgot to save the text before the first computer died. I tried hacks with the new machine and attempted tricks I hadn't thought of in forever. I exploited source cracks and finessed command prompts to walk my way through possible backdoors. I was 3 computers down by Saturday afternoon, and the same old song was getting frustrating really quick. I looked at the text over and over, trying new colors, but the results were largely the same. The BIOS froze, the heatsink melted, the monitors died in a wink of light. I debugged and I juggled, scrambling resources to allocate power to try to muscle my way through. Each new computer I plugged Visuddhimagga into, I'd get a little farther through the encryption before the throws began, whirring like a dynamo until the fan strangled to a halt. But long after dark on Saturday night, something clicked. I was on my last computer when I got the idea to use the 12 text colors I was seeing like a solfege scale, associating the sections of text with frequencies on Schoenberg's 12-tone scale. Then I wrote out the notes for the basic melody of this little light of mine on my palm and used that as my guide to which order the code should be entered. When I was done, I hit enter like I'd done 6 times before, and I waited for the catastrophe I'd come to expect. But neatly as you please, all of the windows that were chewing on code wrapped up what they were doing and closed down one by one until all that was left was a single browser filling the screen with folders. Dying with curiosity to see what was inside, I double-clicked one of the folders. That's when the screen locked and I smelled smoke. I yanked the drive out of the computer in frustration and threw it at the metal wall with a curse. The cheap plastic shell winged off the corrugated surface and then flew out into the concrete hall where it landed with a snap. I hoped it was broken. I was mad as hell. Why did James have to make it so hard? I put my head in my hands and cursed the dead. The blood pulsed in my ears with a fury so loud that I didn't hear the stirring of the little girl that lived across the hall with her mother in a 5x10 cell. Cassandra was a wise 9 years old and steady as a rock while trying to navigate the treacherous waters of 3rd grade in a new school, not to mention living in a new home with bootleg electricity and no water. She didn't bitch or moan. She just sat on the floor in the evenings and studied Abe Lincoln style and did her best to make do while her mom paced the fluorescent halls smoking. I taught her fractions and decimals back when all of the other kids in her class were starting on their times tables. I heard her door squeak open. I liked her, but I hadn't slept or eaten in 2 days. I had failed to crack Visuddhimagga, and now it was broken. I had no computers left. The cipher was a washout, and I was all out of patience. I felt bad if I'd woken her up, but I couldn't chat. I had to leave for church. I started to sigh to try and steel myself with oxygen, but I felt her hand on my shoulder and I jumped.
Easy, big fella,
she said in a funny, quasi-deep voice, trying to sound like a lion tamer in her pink PJ pants and afro balls. She dropped the 2 broken pieces of the Visuddhimagga drive into the palm of my hand.
I was asleep until you started yelling.
I slumped.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm just mad. About what?
I showed her the dead computers and explained how each one had met their fate. I finished giving her an intermediate level lecture on encryption technology a half hour later. When I was done, Cassandra bowled me over with one simple question.
Did you try plugging it in the other way?
What do you mean the other way? She took the pieces of the drive back from my hand and put them together. She held them up between her thumb and finger like a hypodermic needle for me to see. She slid the black plastic protective shield down to reveal the male USB plug. With her other hand, she reached up and snapped the red plastic handle apart from the black shield. Cassandra showed me. There was a second male plug at the end of the red handle, no longer hidden inside the shield. I snatched it from her. Sorry. I begged her to go get the laptop that I'd given to her at Christmas. She came back and I jammed the plug in with shaking hands. We sat hip to hip on the end of the couch as I went through all of the known motions to get to the browser window with the wealth of folders. We crossed our fingers and then I double-clicked. It opened and revealed a directory of subfolders and documents that all opened up whenever I clicked one. Every folder in the browser was just as accessible. The entirety of Dr. James Abraham's career of research and development, private diaries, works in progress, and published papers to boot, was just sitting there on the screen like it had been waiting for me to rescue it from behind a thin veil of ones and zeros. Then it hit me that the encryption was there for a reason, and I suddenly felt naked. I closed the window, ejected the drive, and shut the laptop closed. I gave Cassandra a one-arm hug and tried to pass the laptop back to her. Instead of taking it, she threw both arms around my neck and buried her face in my chest.
We thought you died,
she sobbed.
What do you mean?
I pulled away to give her some air, but she was genuinely shaken.
We hadn't seen you since Christmas. And then on Monday when we came home from school, the manager was telling 2 guys in suits they couldn't go in your room.
Suits? I stuck my face right up in hers. Did they argue with him?
Mm-hmm.
She nodded. Did they try and get in anymore?
They left.
Did you see their faces?
Yeah, I think they were brothers. They looked like they were twins.
Twins? Mystery echoed in my brain. I looked at Cassandra and swirled my index finger in front of my face. What did these guys look like?
They looked mad.